Hello, Laura. I would love it if you would share with us your definition of patriarchy.
Yeah, thanks, Elijah. So, my definition of the patriarchy would really be seeing it as a product of supremacy culture. It's just one demonstration of the same impacts of capitalism, of
Mm.
white supremacy, of the idea that cisgendered heteronormative people are, above or better or more normal than queer people. And I would see the patriarchy as really this dominance of masculine energy over the feminine in all of its forms.
Thank you so much. That's a great definition. Okay. Hello, everybody. I am so glad you're here. I just want to say that I'm here today on the unceded territory of the Ohlone. I want to acknowledge that I have a home, I have work, and I have a life on stolen lands. It's important to me to acknowledge this truth for myself and for others so that we can stop sweeping injustices of the world kind of under the rug. I want to acknowledge that Ohlone still live here in this area and continue to make a difference in the land and the people around them. And I encourage everyone to learn about the land that you live on, to acknowledge it, and to donate to Native-led organizations if you are able to. I am here today. I'm super excited. I'm here with Laura Hartley. She is an activist, a writer, and a coach. She runs an online school to help change makers deepen their impact, prevent burnout, and create conditions for social healing and collective thriving. Hi, Laura.
Hi, thank you, Elijah. It's lovely to see you today.
It's
And also, I'd just like to acknowledge at the beginning here as well that I'm seated on the stolen lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and that sovereignty was never ceded.
Thank you so much. And where is that for people that don't know where native lands are? Where in the world are you?
It's also known as Sydney, Australia.
Yeah, and I didn't say I'm also in what's commonly known as San Francisco, California. So thank you so much for that. I am really excited to speak with you today. I love the work that you do. And of course, this isn't true, but it felt like you developed your work just so that I could have you on this podcast because it's so perfect in what you're trying to do and how you see the way we work in the world now versus what's possible. And I would love it if you would just start out by telling us, a little bit about yourself and how you got here. What was a little bit of your journey?
It's a good question. So I suppose my background and where my interest in this kind of internal work began is really in my childhood. So I grew up with a mother who started one of the first life coach training schools in Australia. I was really surrounded by personal growth from a very young age. And so it was very influential to me. And it really became its most prominent to me when, throughout my adolescence, I struggled with a lot of mental health issues, really severe depression, really severe anxiety. And I decided that I needed to start looking within. And so I started to use a lot of the tools that I've been taught around meditation and introspection and looking at contemplative practices to really explore what was happening inside me. And then this love of this kind of internal world eventually collided with, my desire to really see a much more just, a much more fair, a much more beautiful external world. Because sometimes in the personal growth world, there can be this idea that that we're using our spiritual practice just for ourselves.
Right.
And I really believe that we're using it for each other.
Yes.
That we're using it for the collective good, that it doesn't start and end with us.
Yes.
And so my work then became this evolution of how do I use spiritual practices? How do I use regenerative tools? How do I use introspection as a way to help heal myself, as a way to find groundedness within myself, but also to dismantle some of the structures which show up in the world.
Right.
So I started coaching a number of years ago, and obviously this year I started a school for activists and for change makers. So I'm also a climate and environmental activist.
Mm.
I've looked at well-being economics, and most of my activism now is with Extinction Rebellion, which is a non-violent civil disobedience group. But that's kind of
It's
how I
called,
came to where I am today.
really quickly, I'm going to back up.
Yes,
Extinction Rebellion.
rebellion.
And what is that exactly? Because sorry, I had not heard of that at all. And perhaps
Yeah.
our
So
listeners
they
won't have heard of that.
they are a global movement. So they
Mhm.
started in the UK a couple of years ago.
Okay.
They've spread out across the world. There are a number of different countries, including the US as well.
Mhm.
And they're really about using nonviolent direct action
Mhm.
or civil disobedience, which
Mhm.
is similar tools to what we used in like the civil rights movement or by feminists very early in the last century,
Mhm.
to demand climate action and environmental action, to
Mm.
treat the climate crisis as the emergency that it is, to recognize that we are all within a toxic system
Mhm.
and that we need a much more regenerative culture and a regenerative foundation to our work and our lives, and to start to demand of our governments and transition us to this new world.
Awesome. I love that. Thank you. I will definitely be checking that out. That sounds incredible. Thank you for sharing that. And some things you said really struck me. So we're all inside a toxic system. And this is something that I think about a lot and how that toxic system, I like to say it's the matrix, right? We can't know what it is until somebody points it out to us, because we're just so used to it, we don't question it. And I think that that's human nature. And the idea that we can do work differently, I think, is for some people such a radical notion, and certainly goes against every cultural message we're getting. And so let's start there. What do you see as the cultural message we're getting around what success is and how to be successful, and what it means to, I mean, almost what it means to work well or to be a good worker, right? Like,
Oh,
curious.
oh my God, it's such a loaded topic.
Mhm.
I think, really what we're referring to here is something that I call internalized capitalism. That if we look at the world that we exist in today, and we're looking certainly at Western countries here, they're very capitalist societies. The idea of success is based on infinite growth, on endless growth, on always producing more, on always having more, on GDP always going up. There is very little value given to things like slowing down or uh, retracting or, meaning and rest and pleasure. And so from this point of view, we end up often very unconsciously internalizing these systems that we live in. That to be successful means that we need to be constantly producing, constantly outputting, constantly having results, that we should always be working at the same level, that our success or our value is attached to what we produce. And that's a really big one, especially for women, I think, although I think men have it too. But, as we try to work in corporate worlds and things, there's so much of an idea that we're only good enough if we're just producing this next thing and giving this next thing. And our last work we can't end there. And so this system of internalized capitalism really gets embedded within us. Even a lot of the time when we're working to change the external structures, a lot of us know that things
Yes.
like capitalism isn't actually the best system, that it is causing untold suffering on the planet. But we don't realize how that system lives within us. And that's really what this work is about dismantling.
Yes, I could not have said it better. I love this so much. And I'm going to give an example of a really, really simple way that this shows up, for example, in my work, or not just my work, like with my friends and other women I know. And as you said, I do think men have this too. So, but specifically with women, if I'm working with them and we start with like, let's define what success means to you. And so we can do that, right? Like I find that we can say, well, what success means to me is I would like to make some extra money so that maybe we can go on a nice vacation once a year, but I want to spend more time with my kids, or I want to volunteer or whatever. And so we can lay that out all we want. And underneath it still is the belief that if they're not making money, they're not valuable. It is really, really challenging to unhook from that, as much as we all love to say, define your own success, right? So,
absolutely. And, I struggle with that one myself as well. Like,
mhm.
certainly I'm not, immune from these systems as well. Another way they tend to show up is this idea of time scarcity. We hear it a lot in our voice, this idea that there is never enough time, that we just got to power through, that we have to rush through, that we've got a lot on today. So we're just going to we'll just do this next thing. There's this urgency always, and always this belief that there is never enough time. And so it doesn't matter that, our results aren't where we want them to be now. There's not enough time to get them there either. And so it's very pressured and it's very rushed. And this scarcity is also a product of, capitalism and supremacy culture.
Yes, absolutely. And if there's so much to do and our value depends on all of that, and yet there's not enough time, we're never good enough and we can never actually feel fulfilled. And it's also why when people do reach a moment of like being in a place that they dreamed of being, whatever that is, like maybe when you created your school, I'll just use that as an example, right? I'm not saying you did this, but there's a way in which we don't even sit and enjoy the view before we're like, what's next? What's next? What's next? Again, because as you say it, and I really like that, internalized capitalism, the cultural messaging we get through supremacy culture, patriarchy, and whatever paradigm we kind of want to put on top of it, just what's going on. Yeah. So tell me a little bit about, adding to what you just said, how burnout, then I feel like you just set up the perfect recipe for burnout. And I know that this is something that's dear to you, this working with people to help with burnout. And so what does that mean to you, and why is this important? And how does healing ourselves from burnout, can we say that? Can I even say healing ourselves from burnout? How does healing ourselves from burnout contribute to changing work culture or how we show up in our work?
This is a really good question, and I am so passionate about burnout. And sometimes, I'm really curious as to why, and I haven't fully answered that myself. I've certainly struggled with burnout in the past, but it's something that particularly over the last couple of years, I've become very interested in as to what actually creates it, what needs to change, because, certainly in changemaker and in activist spaces, the burnout rate is huge. And also for entrepreneurs as well. Like if you're starting a new business, like it is so much work at the beginning. And so there's this very high risk that we face of burnout. And really, I think it's important to address first kind of what burnout is. And I think addressing the fact that it is part or a result of chronic stress is important. That it's not something that's happening because we've had a stressful week or a stressful month, or, we just had this big event on. It's really cumulative stress that we have faced in our bodies, in our physical experiences, for often months, years, decades at a time. And we've never fully allowed ourselves to both heal the stress in our body and also really end the conditions which are leading to this in the first place. Because I think there's this big myth that, being stressed or burnt out all the time is just kind of normal or part of life. There's a really popular meme that's like, just being stressed all the time is part of adulting. And it's really not. It doesn't have to be that way. I think that's quite an example of a dysfunctional society, that it is as common as it is. And really looking at burnout then as to why it happens. And I think it's important again to note, it's happening as a result of the way that we work and not the work itself.
Right.
And that's a really important distinction there to have there. So when we know that it's happening as the way that we work, we can look at, well, what do we need to do to change that? What would a radically new way of working actually look like? What would a business, what would a a movement, what would a lifestyle look like that actually supported me and that actually supported my community as well? And that's where we get into some very interesting questions about burnout.
Oh, I just love that so much. I just want to pull this distinction out that burnout, I'm taking notes. That's why I'm looking down, by the way, while you're talking, that the distinction of the way we work versus the work itself. So that I think that that is a very crucial distinction to separate. So the way we work versus the work itself. Not that some work isn't inherently stressful, like an ER doctor, for example, but even ER doctors, like their schedules can be completely unrelenting, so that there's a way in which the way they work, that also applies to them. And I am curious if you see, okay, what are some of the ways that we work that are contributing to stress and burnout? That's my question.
That's another really good question. And you had a good example there about the ER doctor. And I would like to speak to that briefly, that yeah, there are certain roles, particularly caregiving roles, which inherently have an emotional toll to them as well. And that will contribute to burnout. That is one of the causes of burnout, is the emotional toll of the work that we do. But what you don't often see in ER specialties is this idea of having much more space in our work, having shorter shifts so that people aren't as on all the time, having a space there which allows for the emotional processing of the work that we do. Where is the collective space to hold our emotions and what we're going through? And that's a really big one, because then when we're looking at, well, what can we actually do in terms of the way that we work? We're looking at creating space for our emotions, recognizing that we don't all hold the same emotional resourcing or the same emotional capacity all the time, that it changes. I think, the accepting or the glorifying of overwork. I really believe like the future of work should be working less. And I say that as someone who's very, very passionate about my work. Like I love my work, and I have a tendency, I'm to work all the time. I'm very, very prone to that. But this idea that we should actually be working less, we should have more time for our families, for our hobbies, for our joy, for our community, for our activism, for all of these things that we can create more space for. And then I think as well, it comes down to, when we're looking at work practices that lead to burnout and the way that we work, is that value system again. So if we're only valuing our results or our output as the primary measure of what we do, of our success, and not the depth or the quality of our relationships, or the spirit in which we turn up, or the creativity that we have, then we're really using the wrong measurement.
Okay, yes, exactly. And so what that brings up for me, and I want to explore, okay, so you said in the beginning of our conversation, you talked about the definition of the patriarchy as one of the things you said is this masculine energy over feminine energy. And I want to just take one moment to say, when we say masculine and feminine, first of all, it's archetypal. It is not gender related. And it's also language that's convenient, because it's also ultimately arbitrary what we've defined as masculine and what we've defined as feminine. So I just really want to acknowledge that. And I use those words and those archetypes to help lift the veil on what we're experiencing. So I really want to acknowledge that. And you talked about more time for family, relationships, hobbies. I always hate the question of what are my hobbies, because I'm like, oh, who has time for hobbies? I've literally said that to myself so many times. And just reflecting in this meta sense, again, our cultural values. So for example, and I don't know what it's like in Australia, but in the United States, there is no law that says everybody has to have any vacation. So that's just up to whoever they work for, period. Whereas, like, for example, my friends in Denmark, it's mandated that everybody gets 6 weeks of vacation a year, through the federal government. So again, messaging, there's no, emphasis on childcare. There's no emphasis on paternal leave for men when a child is born. In other words, recognizing and supporting family. I just want to acknowledge I'm speaking to that as a heteronormative family, but for anybody that creates family, like the pause that is required with a new child, even if that child is adopted and is older, to ground into what that family is. And so I think about the messaging we get, and also like this idea that relationships and connection and emotional processing. So these are things that are seen as feminine.
Absolutely.
And as you know, the feminine is pretty openly disparaged in our culture. And so that to me that's like, when we look to change the way we work, and not just as solopreneurs, which we both are, but ultimately in the corporate structure, right? It's like, because people literally don't think there's another way to do things, and because these things like emotions, relationships, family, rest, these aren't valued. It's like, how do we even begin? Because they need to become, of course, they need to come up to equal standing, which is, yeah.
Yeah, and this is why this is a really good point, because when I talk about ending burnout, I tend to talk about two things. So there's the ending burnout cycles, which is something that we do individually, of like really working with our body, our mind, our hearts, our personal values, and the way that we work. And then I also talk about the kind of later step, which is ending burnout culture. And ultimately, if we don't change what leads to burnout culture, which are the things I was talking about before around accepting overwork or not having the emotional resourcing set up into our structures, then burnout will just continue to happen. And this is really where the community and the collective work comes into play. And I'm trying to remember where I know this from. I feel like I should give credit to the transition movement for this, or Rob Hopkins. But there's this idea that when we're looking at government or wider change, that it's too much and it's too late. They won't create the change that we need.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to happen. And also when we're just looking at it, when it's just ourselves, like it's not enough. Like, our individual kind of decisions, they have impact, but not enough to create the wider change that we need. And this is where we really come to that level of community. So, and that level of the collective. So who are the people that we are in community with? Who can we speak to within our team, within our direct team, not even necessarily our managers or steps above, but the people who are on our level, within our family, within our friendship groups, and within our movement spaces, so that we can really look at what a culture that fostered thriving would be like, and how we could support each other in doing this work. And I do like to caveat, when we're doing this kind of community work, I think we need a level of resourcefulness within ourselves first. I actually do think the inner work and the individual work comes first. But I also think this work isn't negated either.
Yes, I love that so much. And I agree. It starts with us, right? That's such a cliche almost, but it's so true, because to deepen what you said, just our work in some ways is to question all the things that we've been believing that we don't even realize we're believing. It's just so unconscious, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. We're all in this together. We've all grown up in this messaging, and start and then do your own work to unhook from that. And then for me, I think like starting to even just imagine what would be possible if rest were prioritized. Mm-hmm. Just one thing you could say, or family. What would look different if family was prioritized? And then just, as you say, start to have those conversations. And then,
absolutely.
And to add to what you're saying about how we change things, and it's really why I started this podcast, because I believe that by the way we do business, we really can be contributors to changing the world. It's not the only way, certainly, to change the world. But I see some really cool things happening in the solopreneur place, like people really committing, for example, to pay people a living wage. That feels really important to me, because that's really different from the conversation that we hear around what's the cheapest I can get? Give me a bid. How much will you do for me for how little? Right? Which is sort of that supremacy patriarchal culture. Capitalism. Thank you. Yep. Yeah. And then do you know who Rachel Rogers is?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
She's great. I love her.
She's so great. And so one of the things that she talks about is she does profit sharing with her team, but she's also done things like her nanny is part of the profit sharing. Because why? She can't do her work in the world without the support of this person who is helping raise her children, which is super valuable, right? Like maybe one of the most valuable things we can do. And yet I hear all the time complaints about how much it costs to pay for caretakers and things like this. So, and again, I don't blame anybody. I really don't. And can we start to turn that on its head? Because when we do, what becomes possible? Yeah.
Absolutely. And, when you're starting out as a solopreneur, it can all seem really difficult and overwhelming, and especially when you don't have much budget or anything at the beginning, right? And so of course you're sometimes wondering, who can I pay $5 an hour to sure, get this done somewhere else. But we really need to, and that's one of the such important things, we need to look at the values of the business, and the values of ourselves we want to embody. Because if we're not doing that and embodying that right from the beginning, then the business is never necessarily going to give us the lifestyle that we want to have, or the feeling that we want to have, because we're always going to be chasing that next thing. We're always going to be, in this, again, capitalist hustle culture mentality of, striving and pushing and keep going. And, oh my gosh, in entrepreneurial circles, there's such a thing. You see these slogans like, you got to wake up before 5 a.m. or you've got to hustle, you got to work harder than everyone else, all of these things. And so if we're not abandoning them at the beginning, putting our values into our business and into the people that we work with and into our community, then it's just never going to work. So it's really important, that one.
Oh, I love that. So how might we even begin to think of putting our values into our work, as you say? Again, because I think we're just, if we're not seeing the matrix, it's sometimes hard. And I don't know if you have any ideas of well, how can we start to look at what are our values and how do I embed those into the way I do business?
I think there's a few different ways to do this. I think, first of all, looking at the purpose of the business is a really important one. I think that's kind of foundational. And, a lot of us, or a lot of people, start businesses with the sole kind of metric or the sole purpose being to make a profit. But I actually think what's important, and what a lot of your listeners are probably also more interested in, is starting a business that is about purpose and profit and often the planet as much as anything else.
Absolutely.
So when we know we have those three metrics underneath it of profit, purpose, and planet, then we can start to look more to its wider values. I'm also a big believer that values aren't passive. They're not just something that, they're really verbs, not nouns. So when we're looking at, justice, or we're looking at love or compassion or fairness or creativity or any of these, which can be values, we've got to look to use them in a dynamic sense. So what would that look like in your decisions? In your decisions about how to pay people, and your decisions about who to hire, in your decisions about how to market and how to sell, in the types of offerings that you're creating, in the packaging that you're using, really breaking it down into every level of the business and every decision that you make, which can be very overwhelming, but it becomes very natural after that, I promise.
It does.
And looking at, okay, well, these are my values. How does this value live and breathe in this decision?
Yes, I love that so much. Thank you. I hope everybody listening is taking notes on this. And I'm just going to add something to exactly what you said so beautifully. And I'm going to say it in this completely oversimplified way, which I always say, if you notice you feel skeevy about the way you're doing something, that's the thread to follow.
Yes.
And question it. So my example that I always give is when I first started coaching, I charged more for payment plans because that's what everybody does. And of course, I literally was almost like, that's almost like, it's how I have to do it, right? Like,
yeah, there's no other way. Otherwise, like, what's the point? Why would I offer a payment plan?
Why? Exactly. I didn't question it at all, even though if I brought a little bit of awareness to myself, I felt so gross about it. It felt so arbitrary, and it felt like it was harming people that actually were the ones that were struggling. That's why they needed payment plans. So just as an example. Yeah.
And as another example, something that I'm learning to do, and certainly won't profess to be an expert on this, is to take scarcity out of my marketing as well. Mm-hmm. So very often a lot of marketing, especially in the coaching world and things, is very, very scarcity based. And, you have to sign up by this time or you'll miss out. There's only like 2 hours left, or you'll miss this bonus and things. And there's a way that you can still have close dates for programs and, still offer extras for different things without it being quite so scarcity based, and that's something that I'm still learning, but that I'm enjoying trying to explore how we can do business and sell in a different way as well.
This is like one of my favorite subjects. And so it's one of the ways I create a distinction around it is there's this false urgency that is created, that feels manipulative. Like if you allow yourself to feel into it, it feels skeevy. Like,
yeah, absolutely.
It feels lying. Like you're lying, basically. It's so strange. Yeah. But it's also true that, I'll just use the word cart, your cart will close. There is a time when that'll close, and you can totally let people know that in a non-gross way, in a just like, this is the fact. This is when I'm closing things.
Absolutely.
I really want you to join me. Yeah.
If you've ever looked at a course or a program and something you've really wanted to do, and you felt like this urgency to make a decision, like, you have 24 hours to make this decision, or like this offer is gone for good. Like and you feel like, oh my God, I really want to do it. Do I sign up? Do I not? Oh my God, it's so much money. It's really hard to break out of.
It is so hard to break out of. And if it's a very expensive course, even if it's not, but especially if it's very expensive, that's an important decision to make with your money, and to do it under that kind of a pressured circumstance, which in that circumstance, we can pretty much bet that the false urgency isn't the only manipulative tactic being used, right? That there's really widespread use of basically like, something's wrong with you, and I know, and you know it too. And the only way out of how messed up you are is this program.
Yes, absolutely.
So then include the urgency, and you really feel so jacked up, basically.
Yeah, you feel pressured. You feel like this weight of like, oh my God, and what if I miss out? I'm going to lose these opportunities. This is my one shot. Like the marketing is so intense with those messaging, and it's so common. That is so much of what our marketing in general in society is it tells you, you are missing something. You are not enough as you are. You need this to be happy. This is all capitalism is based on artificial scarcity.
That's right. It
produces the idea of like, in theory, there's abundance. Look at all the goods that are everywhere. You can go to the supermarket and find everything. But the whole thing is based on artificial scarcity, and there not being enough resources, and somebody somewhere along the line has to miss out, and you don't want it to be you. And so if we really want to dismantle these systems, this is why it's so important when we're creating new businesses to really change the way that we do business, change the way that we work, change the way all of these messages show up.
Right. And even like my central nervous system is so much more relaxed when I can honestly, lovingly say, here's how it is. Here's when the card is going to open. Here's when it's going to close. If you want to have a conversation, let me know. Like if I can just, and then the people experiencing, however it is I'm saying that, also that they have a much more calm nervous system as well, right? And
Yeah.
that
And
is
anyone that
radical.
signs up,
It's radical. Yeah,
absolutely. It's so embodied. This is really important to know. Like the things that we're talking about aren't just things that are happening in our mind or, in society. They're happening in our physical body. Our nervous system is reacting to everything that is happening around us. This is why like it's so important that we understand these stories that we're living and acting out, because they're really having this deeper level on our stress levels, on our burnout levels, on our feelings of thriving. But, I'm really conscious that exactly what you said, anyone who signs up for a program or a course with the school, I want to be signing up because they're ready and it interests them and it's right for them, not because they panic bought at the last moment because they didn't want to miss out. The programs will be offered again. They can join at a later stage if it's right for them there, or they can reach out to ask questions. It's not a panic or a scarcity-based decision for them.
Amen. And I want to point out to anybody listening that might feel like scary because the way you've been taught to sell is through, these manipulative tactics. I don't know. I sell more now that I'm not using them. Because the other piece that's pretty interesting in terms of global consciousness is people are kind of on to those manipulative tactics too. So they're definitely affected by them, but they're onto them. And so like, even if they buy, they never feel totally good about the purchase. Like there's a residual resentment about like their hand was forced. And so I just think that there's that piece where people are pretty on to those tactics, or at least more and more are becoming onto it. Right.
Absolutely. And I think, that's partly because, we look at the world around us and it's kind of collapsing in a way. The world isn't what we thought it was going to be 30, 40 years ago. Nobody grows up now thinking they're going to have a really stable life ahead of them,
Right.
or thinking that, their life is going to turn out exactly as they had planned. And so we're starting to clue on to the fact that the cultural stories and the cultural narratives that we were sold as this is the way life is, this is the only way life is, this is the best way life is, actually aren't really real. Very clearly not when you look at the climate crisis, when you look at the rising inequality, all of these issues. And so then we're starting to see, okay, well, like, how else are these systems showing up? Like, maybe I don't trust this quite so much because things haven't exactly worked out the way that I thought they would when I was sold this in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really important.
Yes, I think that's so important. And you just kind of triggered something else that I remember, or that I think about under what people call bro marketing. I call it patriarchal marketing because everybody does it, men, women, non-binary, like everybody, because it's what we've been taught how to do.
What we're told.
Yeah. Again, no judgment, by the way. I just want to be clear. I've done it all, really. But I was like, Michelle, is it Oprah? I don't remember who said, when we know better, we do better. So
Maya Angelou, I think.
Was it Maya? There you go. Thank you. Maya Angelou. My apologies. I'm glad you knew that. So that when people sell and that they say, this is the way to XYZ, as if there's only one path and it's linear and it's clear cut, when in fact it's just what worked for them. I mean, I'm glad it worked for them, right? But it may not work. How many people buy programs and try and replicate
or buy programs and then we're overwhelmed and we're busy and we never start the program.
Oh yeah. Yes, that too. Oh my gosh.
That's another big one. Mm-hmm. And so there's just so much we can unpack with this, but really we're all products of this system. When you Google marketing, this is what you're told marketing is. When you grow up, you were told a business's purpose is to make profit. This is the world that we live in. And so it's really it's not about judging, as you said. It's about unpacking and unlearning, and then really exploring all the different ways that we can do business, and that we can sell, and that we can create cultures within our organizations and within our communities that really foster thriving, and aren't just about pushing on or carrying through. And so much of this work is a lot of new work. It's a lot of, for most of us, it's not something we've ever seen. It's not something we know how to do. It's something that we're only going to get there by feeling our way into it, and by exploring it, and by using our bodies, and by really challenging all of the beliefs that we held about the way things are supposed to be, or the way I am supposed to do something.
Yeah, and that takes some courage because it's disruptive. Yeah. And I just want to kind of come all the way back full circle a little bit to what we were talking about is, even though we try and define like just the simple idea of defining success differently, and yet underneath it is still this idea that, well, my work isn't valuable because it doesn't bring in money. So one of the ways we can start to unhook from that, but also create change, is to openly declare the opposite, and to openly declare, I am feeling off today, and I have decided I'm not working today. I am going to go for a walk in the park, or I am going to binge Netflix. It doesn't matter, whatever I'm going to do. Right. But to own it, and then to say, and that rest is really important, to sort of like put a flag in the ground, so to speak, around, I'm raising this up. I'm declaring this is a value that is equal, to XYZ. I am declaring a value that the relationships in my life and how they stand and how I'm able to connect with these people and how I'm able to treat them is an equally important value as making a profit. Because of course we do need money so far. That hasn't changed. And so I'm like totally down with making a profit. It's just, I want all these other things in the circle too, which is exactly what you're saying. And I could just.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And money is not, in and of itself, there's nothing wrong with it.
Yep. Yep.
It's a completely neutral energy, and
It is.
it's actually the inequality of money that is the problem. It's not money itself.
That's right.
But I think it's also important to say as well, like, when we're looking at these values, that it's not just rest that we need to prioritize, it's also fun. And it's also meaning and pleasure, because sometimes we end up using rest as just another way to then work harder, like so that we'll have more energy later on.
Mm-hmm.
So how are we looking at this much more well-rounded life, where we're paying attention to our spirit, where we're paying attention to what brings us meaning, to what lights us up, to what gives us joy, and then actually factoring these into our lifestyle and into our business cycle, that it's not just about output, rest, on, off, that it's a lot more dynamic and has a lot more flow to it.
So well said. Yes, I could not agree more. And in fact, play and pleasure are two words I like to use. And I am going to be honest, like, I'm totally learning how to do, because or reconnect. I'm relearning maybe, because I think at one point I knew how to do that. And it's
absolutely.
Fun,
and this is big work for all of us. And, I love this work in part because I struggle with this work, because I, particularly as somebody who loves their work, when you do love your work, you can very quickly start to overwork. And I'm certainly somebody that has a lot of internalized capitalism, a lot of ideas that, you need to just work a bit harder and just push through and just keep going. And, this is why I'm so passionate about this work. It's not because I'm perfect, or it's not because, I have all the answers, but because it's an exploration in my own unlearning and our own unlearning collectively as well.
Yes, I love that so much. All right, I could talk to you forever, and we're gonna come to a close for now. We'll just say to be continued. But before we go, I would love for you to tell everybody how they can find you, what's going on, maybe a little bit about the school, whatever you want to share about how people can connect with this amazing work you're doing in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can visit my website, which is laurahartley.com. You can also follow me on Instagram, so at laura.h.hartley. Unfortunately, at Laura Hartley was taken, so at laura.h.hartley. And there's a couple of new courses coming up. So there's one starting on burnout in the next couple of weeks, which is really looking at both burnout cycles and burnout culture. Over the course of a month, it takes you on this journey from the inside of the body through to our values, our stories, and into the collective work needed. So I'm really excited to have that start. And then in the new year as well, around January, we're actually having a course start on a values-driven business. So it's not a business course in the typical sense. It will really be looking at the underlying purpose that you want to have, the ethical foundations to marketing and to the values you want to embody in your business. And that includes social enterprises and movement startups as well. So that will be starting in January. So you can head to my website, you can join the mailing list, or head over to Instagram.
Awesome. And I'll put all these links, by the way, in the notes for this episode. And I just want to acknowledge that Laura and I are speaking on October 4th, and I'm not sure when this episode will be released. So the burnout class may have already happened, but it will be before January. So I just want to say, I want to acknowledge that. Laura, this conversation has been amazing. I'm so deeply appreciative of your time and your brilliant mind and sharing with us today. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for having me on. I've really enjoyed this conversation and I'm really excited about your work and everything that you're doing as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I love it. Okay. Until next time.
Farewell.
All right. Farewell.